Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fox Business Network's Maria Bartiromo in conversation with Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.
That's a good picture. That's terrible. Oh, goodness.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Great to see you. Good morning to you. And Mick Mulvaney, it is nice to see you. Thank you for talking to us today.
Ow.
Mick Mulvaney is not feeling well. Do you want to tell the crowd what's going on?
How many folks here have had kidney stones? Yep. Right now. So.
Oh, my God.
It was a fun night, but it's better than going to the meeting with Chuck and Nancy at the White House.
Oh, we're going to get into that. Let me begin on the breaking news of the moment, and that is out of Venezuela.
Yeah.
The opposition leader is saying that it is happening. Maduro is being taken out. What is the White House saying about this, and is the White House supporting these moves?
We are. I talked to the office a couple times this morning. Importantly, we do not consider it a coup because we recognize Guaido as the legitimate leader of the country. And we are watching it just along with everybody else. The only messages I think we're trying to get out there is that we want to make sure the Russians and the Cubans know they're not supposed to get involved. And that we do and have said a bunch of times that all options are on the table. So we continue to watch this very, very closely, as anyone could imagine. It's a very serious matter. But other than that, I don't think I'm in a position to make much news. I apologize.
Okay, all right. Well, let me turn back to domestic issues, because another very important issue on the table, which is near term, and the markets are expecting it, is the ratification of USMCA. Mm-hmm. You've said that the White House is seeing this as a priority, but Democrats are pushing back. A number of people that I've spoken with, congressmen and women, they say, I'm not signing it in its current form. What do you think? Is there a plan B here?
A bunch of different things. If not signing in its current form. Keep in mind how this works. And is there a plan B? Once we send it to Congress, that's it. It gets an up or down vote. It doesn't get changed. So when they say they don't sign it in its current form, I think what that means is they don't want to sign it at all.
So this is an up and down vote?
Yeah, that's under Trade Promotion Authority. A lot of Democrats do support this. When I talk to some of my Democrat friends who don't, they say, well, for example, it doesn't treat workers fair enough. I'm like, well, okay, but the choice is either what you have now, the status quo, or USMCA. It really is a binary choice. So I would wonder if they think we're being treated better now under NAFTA than we would be under USMCA. Andrew Ullman's going to be on here in a little while from the National Economic Advisor for NEC, and what he's going to talk about, I think, is that our research indicates that this could add as much as 0.5 percentage point to GDP forever. This one deal. It's a huge deal, which is why it's a priority for us, and I fear why you're hearing so much pushback from the other side. If you're wondering, I don't know how many folks live on the West Coast, if the environment in Washington, D.C. really is that poisonous, where folks would vote against a good piece of legislation just because they don't like the president, the answer is yes. That's not new, by the way. I can say that because I was on the flip side of that. I came into Congress in 2011, and there were members of my freshman class who would never vote for anything that would make Barack Obama look good. That is growing in Washington, D.C. It's a shame. If the thing came to the floor for a vote, it would pass. Let's be very clear about that. If Nancy Pelosi put it on the put it on the floor for a vote, it would pass overwhelmingly and bipartisan. But if it doesn't, she controls the floor, and if it doesn't come up from a vote, it's not going to see the light of day.
So what if she demands that it doesn't go for a vote? She doesn't bring it to the floor?
She's the Speaker of the House.
So it just
elections have consequences. I mean, that's the way the world works. I think they have to take action on it within 90 days, but it's fairly easy for 90 legislative days, by the way, which is a really, really long time. But she's got the ability to effectively bury it, which is why we're pushing very hard on our Democrat friends to try and get her to at least bring it for a vote, because it has a broad base of support, especially in the Midwest. It's tremendous for manufacturing. A lot of really good Democrat districts. There's a lot of good Democrat support for the piece of legislation. It's tied up in politics.
If it doesn't go to the floor for a vote, do you go back to pre-NAFTA?
Here's what happens. Okay, so here's you and I talked about this before, which is what's the decision tree look like? Okay, so either it passes and we have it, or it doesn't pass. What are your options? Well, you can stay status quo ante, which is just NAFTA. You could withdraw from NAFTA, which the president has talked about many, many times, or you could go all the way back to the beginning and renegotiate from scratch with the Canadians and the Mexicans. I can assure you, I think it's fair to say that last thing is probably unlikely to happen. So your real two plan Bs are either NAFTA or withdraw from NAFTA. That's another reason we think it's so critical to pass USMCA.
All right, let's move on to China. Yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin was here right before he left for Beijing. He suggested that we're getting real close to either a recommendation to do a deal or a recommendation not to do a deal.
Yeah.
What's most important to the president in terms of having in a deal that they're talking about right now?
The most important thing is doing a good deal. I'm not much of a real estate guy. I was in the real estate business, so I know about this much about it. But I've been around long enough to know when people have deal fever. And we do not have that. We are not going to do a deal. The president is not going to do a deal for the sake of doing a deal. I was actually, you know, I've talked about this before too. I was in Vietnam with the president when he left from the negotiations with Kim Jong-un. He did that because there was no good deal on the table to be had. We didn't do it to send a message to the Chinese, but it had the effect of sending a message to the Chinese, which is, yes, we very much would like to do a deal that is mutually beneficial to both countries. But if it's not a great deal, we're not going to do it. And I think that's the message that needs to get out.
So some of the people in the audience want to get a foothold in China, 1.4 billion people, they want to sell to China. Is it more important to have the Chinese markets opened up to American companies, or the Chinese buying more goods from the US, like LNG, or IP theft, espionage, forced transfer of technology? What's most important?
I think the most important is just the level playing field, right? I mean, and it hasn't been that way for a long time. We don't require Chinese companies to enter into joint ventures. We don't require forced technology transfer. We don't do all those things that we've let the Chinese do for a long time. And that has to change. The good news there is that I think the whole rest of the world agrees with us. They were eager to get access to China. We were eager to get access to China. And we accepted these terms that now appear to be so strange and bizarre and unfair. It's time to rectify that, and that's what this is about.
All right, we'll watch that. The Secretary yesterday made it sound to me that we're in like a 2-week period. We could actually have an announcement within 2 weeks.
I think that's fair. I don't, someone asked me how long is the negotiation going to go on, and I don't have a specific answer to that. It won't go on forever. I think at some point in any negotiation you realize, okay, we're close to getting something done, so we're going to keep going. On the other hand, at some point you just throw your hands up and say, you know, this is never going to get anywhere. And I think you'll know one way or the other in the next couple of weeks. I think that's probably fair.
Let's go back to the White House. The president is meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer today, apparently talking about infrastructure. Is an infrastructure deal realistic in 2019?
Let me put it to you this way. You and I agree that we both have to do infrastructure, okay? You're a Democrat, I'm a Republican. You want to spend more money, I want to spend more money. There are certain things we agree on that could form the basis for an agreement. Here's where it breaks down, however. And it's not around the places that most people think, how are you going to pay for it, sources of revenue, that kind of stuff. That's not where it breaks down. Here's where it breaks down. I explained infrastructure as a pipe, and you put money in one end of the pipe, and then asphalted bridges come out the other end of the pipe. Right now, that pipe is 10 years long. And I've told the president several times, Mr. President, it doesn't make a difference how much money you put at this end of the pipe or how you fund it or where it comes from, where it goes. You won't see a single lane of traffic, of road paved before the end of your second term. We want to shorten the pipeline. It's why you've seen the president a while back with that long piece of paper that folds out to like 14 feet of how hard it is and all the approvals you need to build a road or build a bridge. We want to change the length of that pipeline to get it down under, say, 2 years for a road or a bridge. That's where this breaks down. You want to spend money, I want to spend money, you want to build bridges, I want to spend bridges, I want to change the environmental laws. How do you feel about that as a Democrat? It's going to be a very difficult place for some of them to go, and I think that may be the place where the discussions break down. Yeah. Do I think there's an interest in doing it? Yes. Do I think there's probably more interest, especially on the Democrats' part, to make a show for trying to get a deal? Yeah. I hope the conversations go well today, but if they don't, it would not surprise me. I think it's a much better chance of getting USMCA passed than there is of getting an infrastructure deal passed.
Okay. When you say you want to shorten it, in other words, you want to do more deregulation before you can do an infrastructure deal? Environmental law changes in what regard?
Why spend $1? Why go ahead and commit to an infrastructure deal now and say we're going to spend $1 trillion in infrastructure, but we're not going to change the environment in which it gets built? And so now this $1 trillion doesn't actually translate into something tangible for 10 years. That's not acceptable to this president. And those of you who know the president, his frustration with government regulation is real, and it's honest, and it's born from his personal experiences. He wants to fix that part of the system. He's not interested in spending $1 trillion now for something that's not going to get built until 2029.
Well, you say $1 trillion. Nancy Pelosi just said $2 trillion. So we're going to get back to that in a second. Because I want to look at the realistic idea that anything gets done. Anything. Because the Democrats are attacking the president every day. They want to see his tax returns. He's pushing back. They want to see his personal business dealings. He just sued Deutsche Bank and another bank to say, don't send any documents.
Yeah.
So how is it even realistic to think that on a Monday you're going to have a hearing about impeachment, and then on a Tuesday you're going to have a hearing about getting a deal done on infrastructure?
It's a great question. It's the one reason I really wish I was at the meeting today, because I'd just be fascinated to see whether or not it stays on topic. I mean, if I'm suing you on one deal, are you likely to do another deal with me at the same time? Probably not. That's just human nature. So you're absolutely right. To have an impeachment hearing on Monday, say, and then to think you're going to talk infrastructure on Tuesday, that's not how the world works, let alone Washington, D.C. So the mantra we use around the office is they either have to choose to legislate or litigate. You can't have it both ways. We would love for them to work with us. We think it's actually in their best interest to work for us, because there are, I think it's 15 freshman members of Congress, Democrats, who won by fewer than 5 percentage points. These are the swing districts. These are the folks who got elected saying, if you vote for me, I'll be different than that Republican. I can make Washington work. All right? What do they have to show for their first 6 months in office? The longest government shutdown in history, and now maybe not a significant piece of legislation passing. That's a really tough thing to go back and sell in the re-elect in 2020. So we know there's some center of gravity in the Democrat Party that wants to work with us. But there's another center of gravity that really just wants to fight, and I'd be curious to see who wins that battle. Again, I don't say this in a demeaning kind of fashion. That's how Washington works. I've been in those same conversations. I was elected to the Tea Party wave. I've seen these same, I know exactly the conversation that's going on inside the Democrat caucus rooms now, because there's folks who are more centrist who are saying we need to keep our majority. There's folks who are on one side of the party saying no, we need to go after the president. We need to start impeachment proceedings. These are the exact analogous discussions that were happening almost a decade ago. So it's a fascinating time. It's up to them, because they do control the House. Legislate or litigate, I think you'll probably know in the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Meanwhile, the cost is another issue. Nancy Pelosi just the other day said that she would be open to discuss a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. Now, here we are sitting today with a $22 trillion debt load.
Right.
So when does the debt become important, and important enough to rein in the spending? You were the head of OMB. You're the one who has been the hawk on spending. Would you agree to a $2 trillion plan?
The number, the 1 trillion, 2 trillion, so was it 4 trillion? Those are talking points for press releases. The real question is, okay, how do you get a funding stream? How do you finance it? Those questions get worked out in a real negotiation. Is this a real negotiation? I think it remains to be seen. Your larger question, is the debt troublesome? Sure it is. We were just talking before, there was a gentleman, I think it was on your next panel, who was hearkening back to his days with the Reagan administration, where they were worried about the debt being $1 trillion. I got asked yesterday what keeps me up at night, and it is the debt, but not for the reason that it keeps Mnuchin up, because Mnuchin has to finance the damn thing. I worry about exogenous shocks to the system, where if something happens specifically or particularly overseas that caused some type of crisis, typically we'd be able to fall back on our borrowing ability to sort of get us through that. And I don't know if you can do that when you're $22 trillion in debt. At the same time, I'll be the first to admit that I've been complaining about the debt since I ran in 2009. It doesn't seem to be holding us back from an economic standpoint yet. I don't know if things are different when you're the reserve currency. I think you're in uncharted waters. I think it's always probably safer to have less debt than more, but I don't think debt is really driving the conversation about infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting that the markets don't care about this debt. Do you think at some point the markets are going to care that interest rates eventually will go up, and just the cost to carry that debt is going to skyrocket?
I used to tell people, we will balance the budget eventually one way or the other. Either we'll do it on our own terms, or someone will impose those terms on us. If people stop lending us money unless we do X, Y, Z, we're going to have to do X, Y, Z. We're probably not capable of balancing the budget right now. If something happened, we had to balance the budget in 6 months, Washington probably does not have the ability to do that. Congress, and again, Congress, both parties, the House and the Senate spend the money. That's what they do. It's the Article 1 power is to spend the money. And they've been so used now to borrowing money for so long, I don't know if they know how to do it any other way. So that's one of the other challenges you face.
And the deadline is coming up, the budget deadline, September 30th. You've also got a piece in The Hill today says Trump on collision course with McConnell on spending. The debt ceiling will also have to be lifted. So will the debt ceiling be raised? When do you start reining in spending? Has this become a hot topic going into the September 30th deadline?
It is. It's the one topic we can't get away from. You can choose to take up infrastructure if you want to. You can choose to take up USMCA as a topic if you want to. You can choose to take up healthcare, which we have. You don't get to choose whether or not you fund the government. You have to do it every single year. So it's the one issue we can't get away from. So yes, there will be a head-to-head battle over spending. It happens every single year. And the fight will be how much we increase spending.
I'm glad you mentioned this because you said healthcare and the economy. You're going into another election, and we just came off of a period where the tax cut legislation gave the economy wind at its back. What do you have in terms of wind at your back going into the election? What's your agenda? What does the president run on?
Well, if you hate to sound like a cliche, but are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It's pretty simple, right? It's the economy, Stu, but I think that's easy. People will vote for somebody they don't like if they think it's good for them, and we think that, generally speaking, the economy has been good for everybody, and will continue to be so. The fundamentals that we see continue to be strong. I laugh every time I read Krugman, he was the one who said that we'd be in a depression the day after the election, we'd never get out of it. Then a year later, we could never sustain what we've done. Last month, he said that we were going into recession soon or something like that. I want to get a Nobel Prize for being wrong as often as he is. But we still see very strong fundamentals and believe that what we did in the tax code was not a stimulus. It was not a one-time sugar high. It was a fundamental change. If you didn't participate in the discussion this week about the opportunity zones, you missed something that was very interesting. It's a structural change to the way that we tax, that we're going to fund capital in this country. So there's a lot of structural changes that we've seen. Deregulation is a structural change. You make that change one time, but it pays benefits until someone changes it back. So a lot of the fundamentals we think are still very, very sound, and we can ride that into the 2020 election. We are not afraid to talk about health care at all. Always surprised me when my Republican colleagues say, oh, you can't talk about healthcare. We got killed in 2018 on healthcare. So, yeah, because we didn't talk about it, because we didn't know how to talk about it. Healthcare is a lot more than just Obamacare, which is really a very, very small slice of the healthcare economy. It's for the individual markets and to a certain extent heavily subsidized. Drug prices are a bigger part of healthcare than that slice of the market. Private insurance is a much bigger slice of healthcare. Medicare is a much bigger slice than the market served by the Affordable Care Act. Drug prices, I got my very first 4 Pinocchios ever from the Washington Post. I don't know if they're here or not. And I'm still fighting with them about it because I said that drug prices went down last year for the first time in, I think, 46 or 47 years. It's absolutely true. Washington Post came out and said, no, that's false. Mulvaney's lying to you because here's the information said branded drugs actually went up last year. And they did. Branded drugs account for about 18% of the drug market, of the prescription drug market in this country. The rest of it is generics. And the price of generics came down dramatically last year as the FDA approved a record number of new generics. On average, across the entire market, drug prices came down last year for the first time in 50 years. That's something we can run on. We're not afraid to talk about that. So we're talking about the economy, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about trade, and we think we've got a very compelling argument going into 2020. We also think we have a lot of really weak competitors, which is fun.
Well, you certainly have a good story to tell in terms of the economy.
Yeah.
We just saw 3.2% economic growth for the first quarter, record low unemployment, and yet it feels like the Republicans are incapable of messaging this and communicating this. I still hear all the talking points and all the skeptics saying the tax cut plan went to the rich, it went to corporations, and your average guy and gal in the low and mid-income scale can't find $400 to if they needed it for an emergency.
It's a miracle the president's approval ratings are what they are. Give or take, they're 50%. Think about the balance of positive versus negative stories about this administration. And I think what you see, if the coverage is 80 and some networks 90% negative about the president, how is it possible that he still has a 50% approval rating? First of all, people know it's good for them, despite what the media would tell them. And second of all, this is one of my favorite stories about the president. During the shutdown, And I'm on, boss, I gotta get you on TV tomorrow night. We've been off the air for 2 days. We're gonna talk about the shutdown. He's like, I don't want to do that, Mick. I said, well, no. He goes, Mick, if I go on Hannity, how many people are gonna see it? I'm like, well, on a normal night, about 3 million. When you're on, maybe as many as 4, about 3.5 million. He goes, okay. Dan, get in here. He calls Dan Scavino in, and they put a tweet out, and he throws it on his desk and says, that's 160 million people. Can I go home now? So there's a way to get through that. So yeah, the message doesn't come across in the traditional fashion. It doesn't come across on network television, doesn't come across in a lot of the traditional print media, but the message is getting out there. You don't get to be a 50% approval rating with a 90% negative coverage unless you're doing something right.
Well, what about the income inequality situation, which remains persistent? What's the plan that the White House has to bring up the low-income group?
That's exactly what's happening. Again, from the Opportunity Zone thing the other day, I think wages in Opportunity Zones are up 8% in the first 6 months of the program. We are solving that, improving that. That's how you solve. I know I'm not supposed to say the word capitalism because Frank is here someplace in the back. We're supposed to talk about economic freedom. But the way that you lift people up is by having a healthy economy, which is what we've got. What is it? A couple years ago, there was a wonderful story about when the Democrats were talking about $15 minimum wage. We want you to make $15 working at McDonald's. You actually made $15 working at McDonald's in North Dakota because of the booming economy at the time. That's how you lift people up. And you don't do it through redistribution. You do it through opportunity, which is what we think we're creating. And we think, again, there's one example, that the Opportunity Zones are proving that. It's a fantastic experiment, isn't it? And we're actually taking some very fundamental conservative economic principles and putting them into place. We're giving people more opportunity. We're creating a supply side growth, and it's working. Wages are going up faster than they were under the other ideas. The economy is growing faster than it was under the other ideas. There's a lot of folks vested in seeing us fail, because if it works, if you lower taxes, lower regulation, ease access to capital, the economy will grow. It makes it really hard to sell the other side of the equation. So we're very pleased and think we've got a good story to tell. Yeah, we're going to have a challenge getting it out there, but that's what you do when you're a Republican.
Well, why isn't it resonating?
I think it does.
But you've got, I mean,
it doesn't resonate.
Some people in this audience, as well as other billionaire investors, have come up and started attacking capitalism, saying, look, you've got some socialist plans coming from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and yet now you've got Ray Dalio out there saying, well, capitalism should be reformed. Others saying, well, maybe it's not out-and-out socialism, but we need some safety nets. We need capitalism to be changed.
I don't get too hung up on the labels. I'm not sure, especially I had dinner the last couple of nights with some young folks from all over the world. They're talking about socialism. I have 3 19-year-olds. We talk about socialism. I'm not sure if they actually know what it means. They think that maybe socialism is what they have in Canada and not what they have in Venezuela. Keep in mind that most folks in this room, I'm looking around because everybody's probably about my age, we remember that there were real world examples of how dangerous true socialism, true capitalism was. People get killed by it. People are getting killed maybe today by it in Venezuela. People are certainly starving because of it. But we don't have that same sort of exposure to it worldwide as we did, say, 30, 40 years ago. So there's some education to be done. But the larger discussion about capitalism versus socialism, I mean, that's an age-old discussion, right? So maybe it's a little bit more front and center. That doesn't really bother me too much. I still think we're proving that economic freedom works.
Yeah, economic freedom is probably a better way to say capitalism, to actually have people understand what it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going into the 2020 election, the president's going to be campaigning, he's going to be doing rallies, somebody's got to run the White House. Are you prepared to stay in this role through the next election, or are you looking to go to Commerce or a different cabinet position?
No, this is the last job I want in the administration. This is great. I'm having a great time. People ask me about the acting title. When are you going to get rid of the acting title? No one really cares who works there. The boss doesn't care, I don't care, and the people who work for us don't care. I am the chief of staff. I perform those functions. The president and I get along very, very well. We're all just acting anyway because he could fire any of us except Mike Pence. He could wake up one morning and fire the whole cabinet. So you're only there at the pleasure of the president. So the title really doesn't matter. It has been a fantastic job in that the team that the president put together really had the right pieces and parts. I don't think I've made any significant personnel changes at all. Some staffers, and that's about it. But the pieces and parts are fantastic. We have the right team on the field, we just need to be managed a different way. My predecessor, it's the only thing, I will not say anything bad about my predecessor because he's a true great American. He's a Gold Star parent, a 4-star general. I have a great deal of admiration for him, except for one thing. He openly let everybody know who worked for him that he hated his job. Every single day, he told people how much he hated his job. Imagine what that would do for the morale in your operation, and you could imagine what it did for our morale. That was a mistake. Once you fix that, I think we've been able to fix that, things have gotten dramatically better very, very quickly. I think people like working in the White House. They love working for this president, and we're having some success, so it's a fun place to work.
Will there be a lot of changes before 2020 in terms of cabinet positions?
I don't think so.
You think people who are there are going to stay in those roles right now?
Yeah, now's about the time people would start to leave anyway. 2.5 years. So there'll be some turnover. But I think you've seen with the change at the Attorney General with Mr. Sessions, the change at State with Mr. Tillerson, the change at DOD. Those are the big ones the president wanted to get behind him, and I think he's done it.
And how much of an issue are all these investigations around the president right now?
They take a lot of time. But we still run the country. I mean, people think, oh, you're not doing it in the White House, it's grinding you to a halt. No. I mean, today we'll have a meeting on trade, you're meeting with Pelosi. I think yesterday we had a meeting on spending. I mean, we still run the government, or at least the executive branch of government, every single day.
Are there other priorities you're working on that I didn't mention?
Trade is the big one. I think trade, because that's the one we think is achievable. So I think if you could wrap up, you can go to the re-elect and say, okay, the first 2 years we got tax bill plan, the second year we got USMCA passed. Those are two biggies.
Mick, thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Mick Mulvaney.
Thanks, y'all.
How are you holding up?
I'm doing all right. The medication.
For part 2 of this discussion, please welcome back Maria Bartiromo and your panelists for Perspectives on the U.S. Economy.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk about reaction to Mick Mulvaney. What struck you first? Alan Schwartz.
Well, look, you covered a lot of ground. So let me just pick up on one topic. The opportunity zones, number one, has not gotten a lot of attention, but it was one of the actual few bipartisan things in the tax bill that people agree with. And it's a very interesting opportunity to see how it plays out. But the other thing attached to it, I believe, in a world where economic growth is hours worked and productivity, as we are now in an era where the working age population is declining, driving productivity has got to be a very, very important part of our long-term economic policy. And what he talked about, which is take an infrastructure build. If you go back over the years, building out infrastructure has been the times in the economy where we have then had a big follow-on pop in productivity because investment follows infrastructure. But the thing he talked about, it's impossible to drive productivity if your infrastructure takes 10 years to build, and then every business that wants to tap into that infrastructure has to go through this regulatory web. And he touched on one part of it, which is important, I believe, which is to, maybe on a bipartisan way, pick a way that a good commission could figure out, okay, these things work without going to court with 10 different regulatory challenges. And then one thing I've talked to the White House about at times was to create an infrastructure bill that required every local government and municipality, because the biggest challenge is state and local regulation. To say, we'll build infrastructure in yours, but you have to reduce the regulatory drag on business investment. Things like permitting, number of jobs that require, licensing and things like that. So that was one aspect that I think doesn't get enough conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie Dimon has said many times, look, if you want to build a bridge, it takes 13 years just to get the license. So this has been an issue.
Exactly.
Andrew Olmem, I won't ask you to react to Mick Mulvaney since you work with him.
Well, I thought he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, so,
I will say that I would just want to echo, the chief's done a great job about building morale in the White House, and it's a great place to work, and particularly under his leadership.
Why is it, and this is a question that I asked Mr. Mulvaney, why is it that it seems like the Republicans have a hard time communicating some of the benefits of what you all are doing in terms of the tax cut plan? I mean, there's this constant pushback that the tax cut plan, for example, was not felt throughout different income levels, that it all went to the rich.
Well, first of all, I do think the average American voter really appreciates what's going on and how good the economy is for them. This is a long, standing critique. I've been in Republican policy making for a long time now, and you always hear, how come the Republicans aren't doing a better job explaining their policies? Certainly there's a dynamic with the media that we have that the Democrats don't have to deal with. But I do think at core, the president is very effective about communicating directly to voters and to Americans. And I think that, as Chief pointed out, despite really strong negative media coverage by the mainstream media, our message is still getting out. And I think if you ask the average American, are things getting better? Are the policies working for you? The answer is yes.
Well, you did have that 3.2% growth in the first quarter, and of course you're looking at a good performance in terms of unemployment. But Aaron Klein from Brookings, you don't see that actually hit all Americans.
So look, growth has gone well. The employment market's gone well. President Trump came to a brilliant conclusion about life, which is the best thing you can do is inherit well. And we started this recovery in 2010. This is going to be the longest economic expansion in American history. By the way, economic expansions have been getting longer for a long time. The 90s was the longest expansion previously. It's kind of like baseball games. We're not entirely sure why, but they keep getting longer over time. What struck me from Mulvaney's comments were this kind of false dichotomy between legislating and uncovering truth. So let's deal with infrastructure. So in 1998, a Republican House passed a large infrastructure bill called T21. This is kind of the big transportation infrastructure bill that I'd love to get done, and I think the White House is talking about very positively. In 1998, Republican Bill Clinton signed it. What else did the Republican House do in 1998? Vote to impeach Bill Clinton. So this idea that you can't simultaneously enact common sense infrastructure that grows the economy while at the same time pursuing a different legislative agenda. I mean, we did it in the 90s. Why can't we do it now?
Okay. He said, and I thought this was newsworthy, he said that it's likely more of a chance that USMCA gets passed than a infrastructure plan.
So I think, look, I don't know about handicapping that. I think with regard to the infrastructure bill, there's a path to getting this passed with more revenue, more incentives, more economic growth. If we have that type of long-termism, it's not a question of how many lane miles are going to be built before the next election, and we can get into why that's not necessarily calculated properly. But what it's really about is, are we going to borrow money or raise revenue for long-term investments to grow our economy, or is it a short-term sugar rush to try and juice the economy before the election? The long-termism, and Alan's exactly right about this with infrastructure, that's the type of investment that I think there's a common ground for, and that we've heard some positive encouragement from both sides on.
Yeah, but this is one of the issue because of the cost. Now, Alan, Nancy Pelosi just said $2 trillion. The debt load currently at $22 trillion. Are you comfortable with that kind of a cost?
So let's take it apart. Point number one, I'm the person that Mick was talking about where I got visited by Stockman and Kemp if the 80 election and saying it's economic Dunkirk because our debt's going to reach $1 trillion and that's going to set off all these alarms. So it's kind of interesting to think about in perspective.
Yeah, that's why.
But I think a couple of things on that. First of all, I think our politics are way more divided than they were in 1998. And I think there's all sorts of trends on that. We do not pass any bipartisan legislation. We just don't. 80% of the country believes the Dreamers should stay in this country. For 20 years, they have not been able to pass a bill. 90% of the country says they believe in background checks. There is zero chance you're going to get something on that. And so as we've become more and more divided, the only laws that get passed are passed when one party controls the legislation. They pass their agenda. And then they immediately say, well, we have to attack that agenda if we're going to get back into control. So, but going back to your point, which is a very important point, I think that the long-term trends in spending and revenues are what really matters. And that's what, even going back to Jack Kemp, that's what you had to focus on. It's not the amounts, it's the trends, like any business. And when we conflate OpEx and CapEx, you're really missing the point. If you looked at any business and said, what are you spending on operation? What are you spending on capital improvements? You look at those very, very separately. So if we had an infrastructure bill that we truly believed was done in a way that was going to drive productivity and create a return, I would say that's a good thing to do. We have the capital today, invest it in a return. That's different when our budget deficits keep growing with things called entitlements, and we don't reform those. There is not a long-term return from that, and there is not a plan to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, we know Social Security is going broke, Medicare is growing broke. Is there a discussion within the NEC about reining in spending?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the president's budget, it calls for a wide range of spending restraints to help control spending. But I think you have to have a little bit of perspective on this. When we came in as a new administration, we really did believe that the U.S. economy was underperforming, and getting the U.S. economy's growth rate was the first priority that we had to do on the economic agenda. Because once the economy starts growing, right, that starts to improve your tax revenues, starts to take care of a lot of problems. We're doing that. Like, as we mentioned, the economy is now growing above 3% on trend and over year. So we've got that. We've made good investments already with the tax reform, with our regulatory reform agendas to keep that going. I think that will help balance the debt to GDP ratio going forward. Now, I will also say, this has been an issue that has been a long time in Washington. Goes back, as I mentioned, back to the 80s about what the right level of debt and deficit should be. And it's certainly something that we are certainly focused on, but one has to remember about priorities. And getting the U.S. economy moving again, I think it was the right move to have that as the priority. Certainly, the U.S. debt to GDP ratios have grown, and I agree 100% with Chief Mulvaney about the need to have some, as I say, cushion in case you have a foreign policy event or another significant downturn in your debt to GDP ratios. But the United States has the ability to float its debt at its current level. I don't think there's any dangers of default. We have sometimes I think some of the hysteria a little bit about the debt to GDP ratio blows a little bit out of proportion. Certainly it's an important priority, and it's something we like to control, but one has to look at it in a larger economic picture.
I guess, many people will say, look, the time to handle the debt, get your hands around the debt, is when you're in a prosperity times, right? When you've got economic growth that we have right now. So wouldn't it be relevant to be doing that now, reining in the debt now, lowering spending now, while you have 3.2% economic growth?
Which you will start to see those debt to GDP ratios going out will start to decline as the economy continues to move up. Trying to deal with deficit and debt to GDP ratios when you have a 1.5 growth rate is incredibly difficult. Moving our growth rate, doubling our growth rate is going to make solving that problem much easier. That's why I say, from a policy-making perspective, you have to determine your priorities and sequencing, and certainly getting the growth rate up had to take priority.
Aaron, you've been nodding your head while Alan was talking, certainly.
Yes.
What's up?
So, I think there are a couple things. One is, we just had $1 trillion increase in defense spending. That's $100 billion a year, 10 years. That's not defense spending, that's the delta in defense spending. There wasn't a giant conversation, oh, how do we pay for this? What's its effect on debt? It kind of went through without a big debate. I'm not sure why our previous defense spending needed such an ROI increase for long-term investment. When it gets to infrastructure, things that were going to change the fundamental GDP trajectory of our economy and improve our quality of life, right? Who here enjoys sitting in traffic, right? Then all of a sudden it's, oh, well, how do we pay for it? What about the debt and deficit? $1 trillion of military spending just signed, kind of ho-hum, not much conversation. You're exactly right. This is the time when you're at record low unemployment, when you're at strong economic growth, that you should be seeing the deficit go down, not up. What's the driver? The driver's the tax cuts.
Well, the driver, though, of the debt is largely the entitlement growth, right?
The change. What's changed over the last 2 years? It's not Social Security and Medicare. It's not our demographics. In fact, some of the cost controls on the healthcare side. We spend a lot of money on healthcare, and I'm not sure you see the benefits, right? There's an inefficiency in that. But what's changed? The tax cuts. We lowered $1.5 trillion of revenue, right? And now you see more debt. It's not that complicated.
Andrew?
Yeah. So first of all, it is an investment in the long-term economic prosperity of the United States. The first is, the center of the tax reform bill was reforming the corporate tax rate. The United States' corporate tax rate had made us uncompetitive in the global economy. If you look at the number of corporations that were inverting, changing their headquarters to be outside the United States to avoid our high corporate tax, it was on a significantly upward trend. And now that we have a competitive corporate tax, that's going to really help the United States be, along with our other reforms that we're working on, the place where companies want to do business. And instead of deterring companies from working here, they're going to be locating. That is an investment, both not only dealing with long-term deficit issues, but the long-term economy that was worth making.
No, most CEOs of big businesses, Alan will say, if there's an 8% tax rate in Ireland and 40% tax rate in the US, I'm going to go buy a company and move my headquarters to Ireland.
Well, that's absolutely correct. And I think this debate about short-term, long-term, I think that, I said to my friend Tom Brokaw one time, the sequel to The Greatest Generation was, how did they raise the most self-absorbed generation in history, the baby boomers, of which I'm one. And a lot of this is generational and how much we want to focus on the long-term versus the short-term. Now, corporate taxes, my belief, had to be reformed. We were so uncompetitive. It was so distorting, because deciding that you get taxed based on where you are headquartered instead of where you are producing goods and services or economic gain is a silly system. The rest of the world, all the rest of the world went away from it. There was one country left in the world that said, we are taxing your global profits at our rate, right, when you bring them home. So the tax, that was silly, but there wasn't a bipartisan, and this is where I go back to, every time you pass a law, there was a lot of good things in the tax reform, but if it had been bipartisan, they would have had a slightly different mix, and both parties could walk away and say, okay, at least we got that done. My own, dealing with like my old partner Kudlow and people like that, when we were talking about it, it just, you don't want to get too wonky, but driving corporate tax rates down did not require driving pass-throughs and LLCs down, right? That's personal income, and they only existed because of our punitive corporate tax rate. But small business said, hey, we want to get our share as well. I don't think we needed to bring upper income tax brackets down at all. I don't think it's about stimulating work. There should be a debate about the way we tax capital. Look, if you take a step back, demographics are the destiny or the future that's already happened, right? And when you get these waves of demography, when baby boomers were coming into the workforce in huge numbers, you wanted to incentivize their work, and you wanted to incentivize capital that was short relative to the demand. So we came up with reducing dividend rates, reducing capital gains. Over time, that switches. We now have a lot of capital, and we have fewer people coming in demanding it. And on top of that, with globalizations, we have what Bernanke and Greenspan's talk about, the global savings glut. So these are complicated subjects to try and, if you're running a business, you would say, what are all the things that have changed and how do we want to position ourselves instead of just focusing on one piece? And so I think if we could get down, have a long-term look at what are the trends in spending, because I'll just say this, globalization was a deflationary wave and created a global savings glut and a lot of pressure on inflation, which means you can run up a lot of debt. As the cost of debt comes down, you can run up more. But if we get a peak of globalization because of the pushback that we're seeing from populism saying free trade isn't fair to us, if that swings back and we start to see a cycle of more inflation and higher interest rates, that's when all of a sudden the debt burdens are going to get very strangling.
And why do you think the markets haven't reacted to the $22 trillion in debt?
I think because of the global savings glut and
it's a long-term thing.
And it's a long-term issue. So, it's just like, what happens with companies, right? You can have a company that's triple B or double A for a long time until some of the things that they've neglected show up, and then everybody shows up and says, well, you should have been doing this for 20 years. We're going to punish you now.
Yeah, the markets, it's interesting you bring in markets and ratings, because I was in the Treasury Department the day we were downgraded for the first time. And you know what happened? Treasuries rallied. There's something that's going on in the markets that's a little bit disconnected from the fundamentals. But I think
maybe markets are right.
Look, who am I to question the wisdom of markets? On the other hand, markets have a way of crashing back down to earth pretty sharply.
Yes.
What I do think is important is kind of questioning about, are we going to turn around and make the investments that we can, that we know, it's, workforce, infrastructure, investment in human capital, to grow the economy going forward. We can debate about the corporate tax cut versus why the estate taxes, why was the deficit raised to increase the estate tax yet again? Biggest winners of the last time the estate tax was cut, the Steinbrenner family. They inherited the Yankees tax-free, right? This perpetual generation of capital accumulation, and you see it in other areas about this unfairness of society. You see it in the college admissions scandal. You see it in other aspects. And when you talk about kind of what's bubbling up, why are people so angry? It's because the feeling is that the system isn't working for them, that it's not fair and equitable, right? People want a fair shot at economic opportunity and prosperity. But when they see perpetual wealth accumulation with zero, you can pay zero in taxes as a company and transfer that money at various levels infinitely without paying your fair share, it gets people pretty upset.
But do you disagree with the idea that capitalism or free enterprise or
No,
economic freedom, as Mick Mulvaney just said, doesn't that lift boats in the lower income scale?
It's a straw man argument when you then kind of ask the question about, okay, well, who's paying for all this stuff? Freeways aren't free. This intergenerational point.
Well, who's paying for what? I'm talking about capitalism and the free markets and the free enterprise. I'm not talking about free college and free stuff.
Free defense. Who pays for the army? There's collective goods, right? We don't live in this kind of animal farm utopia.
Pay for it.
Huh?
Taxpayers pay for it.
Right. And who pays what share in taxes? Right? That's the question. What you've seen is a radical reduction in the tax burden among wealthier people, and you've seen a giant increase in the spending of the United States government.
Well, taxes went down for every income level.
Let me jump in, Maria, because as you know, at the Milken Institute, we started, at my suggestion, we started doing panels on income inequality 10 years ago, because this is a driving force throughout history, and the stridency of the debate, it's either capitalism or socialism. That's not what it's about. Shared prosperity is what it's about. So when you say, again, I was involved with the Reagan movement, basically trickle-down economics, rising tide. You got to look at the numbers, and you always, just like a business, you got to say, what's actually happening? It's not whether we should be capitalist or socialist. It's how do we make sure that capitalism is working the way it has in the past. If you go back, just take a simple number like wages, salaries and wages as a percentage of the total economy. All right? It's gone down in the post-World War II period. It was in the low 50% of GDP. It got a little too high in the 60s and 70s, and we got inflation. It got up to the high 50s. It came back down under Reagan into the 50s. It's now 40%. right? So you just sit there and look at the outcomes. Corporate profits, I'm a big champion of corporate profits. It's what I do for a living. But corporate profits are at their all-time highs as a percentage of the economy. You take the average person, they don't want to hear a debate about should you tax this way, should you do this, should you. They're just basically saying if something that used to be 50-50 is now 60-40, it's not working for me. And it's our responsibility, that's the people, if you look at the right wing and the left wing, what's really coming is class warfare. If you look at 11% of Bernie Sanders voters voting for Donald Trump, you go, what's going on here? It's basically saying, we think you people that are up there that have been running the economy, running business, running government, we think you're idiots and you don't think about us. We need people to take care of us. It's about throw out the rich. So look, something I used to use as a quote from the lessons of history in our panels on this, they said, throughout centuries, what we've seen, when the masses think the elites have too much, one of two things has happened. Legislation to redistribute the wealth, and they didn't say by tax, they showed how letting serfs own their land in Greece around them to have an opportunity, or revolution to distribute poverty. Those are your two choices historically, and debating it back and forth, saying, no, it's capitalism, no, it's socialism, is what creates revolution.
By the way, I would say that that's one of the reasons Donald Trump won the election.
So let me add some color, because I agree with Alan, but I think there's a third way solution. And let me just get specific in the world of financial services, which is one I know well. So the huge growth in overdraft fees, which are only borne by people who hit zero on their bank account, which gets to your point about the people who don't have $400, right? What was the name of the yacht that the CEO of TCF Financial in Minneapolis called his yacht? Overdraft. Now, why does a check take 5 days? Right? In Europe, you can deposit a payment from Latvia and Portugal faster than you can from Minnesota to Florida. Right? When you really drill into this, it's because the Federal Reserve hasn't modernized its system with technology that's more than a decade old. England had real-time payments when the first iPhone came out in 2007. When government stops working for working people, people get angry. I don't worry about when my check is going to clear, but there's solutions, common sense solutions that government can take, like real-time payments, like other things that make people's life better. But when people see yachts named overdraft, and they just lost $35-70, they get angry.
You want to comment on overdrafts, Alan?
Wait, look,
No.
well, let me, how do you want to do it? So, first of all, I think when
I'm allowed an overdraft, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, I just say on perspective. I agree that there's a lot of dissatisfaction right now with the U.S. economy. I think sometimes we look at we fail to kind of see some of the more practical solutions that are out there and some of the other driving factors. But I do think overall the United States economy has taken an important step in the right direction over the last 2 years. And one has to, if you look back over our 200 years, you know, the United States is still the best place in the world to live and do business. And we always have to remember that we've got a good structure here that the rest of the world really envies. But how do we make that better? And going to the shared prosperity concept, which I fully agree needs to be addressed. I think one thing is we need to think about is workforce development. You know, I think most people are surprised to know that only a little more than 30% of Americans actually have college degrees. It's actually a frustration of mine in policy debates as we think about how to make sure the United States continues to be the most competitive place on the planet. You know, historically, the United States has had the most educated, most productive workforce. This goes back to the Industrial Revolution. The United States workers, you know, could read faster. More of them could. They were the place you wanted to have a business. We need to make sure we keep that edge, but we oftentimes think about our policies and, you know, are very focused on oftentimes college educated, and we've forgotten, in my view, the 70% of Americans who don't have a college degree, and making sure that they have the skills they need to be competitive in this rapidly changing workforce and economy. You know, the federal government right now has $1.5 trillion of student loans on its books. And student loans certainly play an important part of making sure the American dream is there, and that for those who want to go to college have the ability to do so, and that's very important. But if you think about in terms of resource allocations, that's 1.5 trillion being dedicated to the 30% or so who receive a college degree, and who generally will have much higher incomes than the other 70%. We need to do a much better job of thinking about how we make sure the rest of our workforce has the skills and ability to be competitive and highly productive. And I think they can be, and there's lots of examples of how this can be done, but it's not as big a focus and priority as it should have been, which is one of the reasons why the administration has created the Council on the American Worker, headed by Ivanka Trump, to examine these issues and work with Congress on legislation to improve how we do higher education, how we do secondary education, and improve the quality of our workforce so that more Americans feel that they have the ability to be productive. I think another area too, while I'm on this topic, another area we need to do a better job of thinking about is entrepreneurship. And for too long, I think entrepreneurship has evolved into this idea that you're going to start a computer company in your garage, and next thing you know, you're going to have you're going to be going public. But most entrepreneurs are local small-town businessmen. You know, I think I grew up in a small town of about 7,000, and there were lots of entrepreneurs there who had small businesses, made a good living for themselves, felt that they were providing not only for their families, but also making a difference in their communities. I think we need to do a better job of making letting young people know that entrepreneurship is a really valuable career, not only for themselves but also for the larger society. Those types of works and policies, I think, get to this issue in a very constructive way that leaves people feeling that they have the skills, that they have the autonomy and the ability to be a self-governing person in kind of that classic American fashion, rather than somebody who's kind of dependent on a government subsidy for their living. Those are the types of policies that I think can get to this issue.
No, I think that's right, and your point on education is well said. I mean, I think we're number 35 in secondary schools.
Yes.
So it's amazing that you're in an election campaign period and you're hearing all these solutions for all these things, but I never hear anything about education.
No, you're right. And look, I think there was the CEO of Infosys was on a panel yesterday talking about working with community colleges to bring in, and I think you're starting to see it. You've seen it from J.P. Morgan, you've seen it from IBM. I think that community colleges, for example, can make a bit, not everybody needs a liberal arts degree to go work in the workforce. There's a different set of skills. If you look at the way Germany trains its workers, for example, you see higher productivity. I do believe there are some good short-term things happening in the economy. The question is, how do we build on them? The most important right now, if you see how the Fed backed away from tightening, the reason was, I believe, one, they didn't realize the global nature of what was happening to tightening. But away from that, when they were seeing inflation pick up with wages, all of a sudden it was coming back down because we're seeing a pickup in productivity for the first time in a long time. Now, if we can keep getting capital spending to follow through, if we can keep getting some less regulation to flow through, and we could get some productivity, that could put us on a path. But I think we're sitting here talking about the government the whole time. As I said, the corporate sector is a big part of this, and I do believe there is an awakening in the corporate sector. And I don't think it's about capitalism is bad. I think it's about how are we going to make sure capitalism is embraced. Again, talk about the people who do not feel like they're sharing in the prosperity. Who are the people now that rank the lowest in the esteem of the basic population? Government and business. It's basically saying, those of you that are winning, we think it's not fair. So it's not, the government isn't going to turn all this around, and you're seeing it. You see how Walmart has changed its rules. It's really impressive to watch. And so I think we need to see the leaders of the country, and those are corporate, and those are political, and those are religious leaders, but the leadership has to try to come together instead of saying, let's yell at each other about how your policies are so much dumber than all I have to prove is that's really dumb, so elect me for something that's less dumb. What about getting together and trying to say, we can turn this around because we're the United States.
So
and that's what's happened before.
Let me take the first step and say, I was thrilled about Andrew's comments about student loans. And I think something good in the tax cut was actually they put a tax on elite university endowments. And you have to ask yourself, what is Harvard doing with $38 billion of investment? Who are the highest paid people? The people that manage the investment fund. What is this? If you were an alien, would you say that this is a $38 billion hedge fund that runs a small university not for tax purposes? No, right? But where are we getting with this point? Yeah. Second point.
So you want to tell Harvard how to spend this money?
No. Well, look. Are hedge funds tax-free? No. I'm not saying that. What I do want to do is have them admit more lower students if they're going to get a tax-free basis. In addition, it's not just Harvard. I'm going to pick on their elite. Clemson University just made news by giving its college football coach the largest contract in history. I did a little digging. Clemson pays more to the top 4 coaches on its football team than it gives in student aid to its entire freshman class. Is this a nonprofit
you're either
university?
a capitalist and a free market person or not. Are you going to tell Clemson what to pay their coaches?
No. Clemson is running a taxable nonprofit, or are they running a for-profit football team? If the NFL players pay taxes, right? The NFL people also pay their employees, by the way. But what I am here to say is what the administration started this conversation, right? I wouldn't have used that revenue. I would have said very different things, but I wouldn't have used it for corporate tax cuts. But starting that conversation and looking at some of these holy cows and ask yourself, why are these things created in a structure that you're given an authority to be for America? Clemson, on its mission statement, says that it wants to build the next generation of leaders in South Carolina. South Carolina is almost 25% African American. Clemson is less than 7%.
So you're saying when you're a nonprofit and you're judged differently than the free market, then you should have different rules. Because you could say that in every profession. I mean, why do celebrities get paid what they get paid?
For example,
and do you want to regulate that?
Fantastic philanthropy here. You have endowment rules that you have to spend out. Those are waived for colleges. Those are waived for universities, right? We put things, capitalism. The Congress, one of the great acts was requiring each state to put a university to create education as a ladder and opportunity for success. But what you have to do is have the oversight to follow through to make sure that that's where the money's going and those are the opportunities being provided. Wake Forest, in the admissions scandal, reserves more spots for student athletes than the entire African American entry class.
Reaction.
Well, I just want to go back to Alan's.
I'm going to moderate. Why don't you react? Come over here. You can debate this.
I'm just a moderator.
I know you want to. Come on.
I want to go back to Alan's little bit of pessimism and get his head out of the oven, so to speak, about Washington. I mean, I agree that partisanship has definitely increased over the last 20 years. But I do think one can, again, lose perspective. The administration has been very willing to work with Congress on a bipartisan basis, particularly when the Democrats are willing to, and we have been able to. I think we've lost perspective on and forgotten about. We passed significant Dodd-Frank reform legislation on a bipartisan basis. We passed prison reform recently. So there are areas where we can work. I think there are 2 issues that one has to remember. Sometimes it takes a little bit to build the consensus. And having worked in Congress for a long time, I have a kind of perspective on this, is that in a country of 300 million people, it sometimes takes time to build that political consensus. And a lot of the debate that you hear on TV and stuff, it looks very partisan, but a lot of times that's how we build consensus for our political institutions to work. It can be a bit messy at times, but I do think that's how you take these steps forward. And I think we're in that process right now with infrastructure. And the second thing is, I sustain Alan, my golden rule in politics and economics is, never bet against the United States. And we have a really remarkable capacity to reinvent ourselves, to address problems. We still have a fantastic democracy, and I think we are in the process right now of tackling a lot of these problems that you're legitimately worried about. And I just feel maybe a little more optimistic and don't want to have you be so pessimistic here,
So I can be optimistic if we get some changes. I will say, look, A wise man told me if you really want to understand a subject, break it down into its component parts. So take politics. He proved to me poly is Latin for many, ticks are blood-sucking parasites. So that's the essence of politics. But that's what we become, because the point, look, you can chart the amount of bipartisan legislation that we've had. It's on the decline. You can look at how basically the primaries now dictate who wins the general, and therefore the people in the primaries. Take an example. You know, in Connecticut, Joe Lieberman lost his primary, ran as an independent, trounced his opponent because the general population liked Joe Lieberman. That was because he was in a state that didn't have a sore loser law. But in 44 states, if he loses in his primary, he's not allowed to run in the general, so people dictate from there. I think, I'll give you an example your boss just brought up. It's a question whether some piece of legislation or approval of a trade agreement that he is highly confident would pass with a significant majority. It's a question as to whether he'd be allowed to get to the floor to get a vote. So if it takes a while to build a consensus, why are the rules consistently? And people don't realize a lot of this is how the rules have changed, right? So the rules are there to keep the partisan wings from delivering. And so I believe a lot of the debates that go on about, you know, this party and that party, it's really because, look, under the way our government was set up, brilliantly, I think, by our founding fathers, each branch of government had responsibility. Congress's responsibility was to pass laws. When consensus changed in the 50s, in the 60s, we had civil rights, we had women's rights, we had a lot of things that said, we created consensus, let's pass new laws. We don't pass new laws very much anymore unless one party is dominating. That's what has to change. And where I'd be optimistic is if younger people are going to rise up and say, we need to change the system. Because people tend to think that the way we elect people was set up in the Constitution. Not true, right? The rules of the game have been changed a lot over time. We can change them back to more reflect the way the general population feels instead of just the 7% of the electorate that shows up in the primaries and dictates who's going to win the general.
Well, let me ask you this. Let me go back to wages for a second. Why do you think they haven't moved before the last couple of years?
Globalization. I think that, look, I don't want to talk, but the reality is we had a wave when here's the interesting thing. Communism, it was capitalism versus communism for like 50 years. Communism collapses, capitalism wins, right? Now, but communism brought billions of new workers into a game, which, by the way, we had changed the rules of the game from the Bretton Woods, which was there to keep capital from flowing all over the world. We got rid of that just as billions of new workers come in, capital flows to them. It's a major disruptive event. It comes down the middle. Those who can participate in the global growth do very well. Those who are competing with those workers get pushed down. And then to the point I made, we could have responded to that. We say, look, this is a net big positive, but we have to do some things with worker training to adapt to the changes that are coming to our economy. Let's work on that. But instead, we just said, let the market decide. And so that's pushing down workers. And one of the things I've said is, wouldn't it be incredibly ironic if it took the collapse of communism to bring about the unequal outcomes that the communists said would bring about the collapse of capitalism? So we have the choice as to whether or not we want to have shared prosperity, but we better get on it.
How do you get on it?
That's a very complicated mix of policies. I think some of the things both guys are talking about, we got to get around. A lot of it has to do with near term. It has to do with what I think we're seeing from corporations and trying to drive productivity. Long term, it's all about education, about worker training, about repositioning those, and some socioeconomic policies that, you know, you have to look at your safety net and see, does it need to be strengthened, and know the ways to do it.
So, I mean, let's start with what should be much more simple. Raise the minimum wage. Our minimum wage is not indexed to inflation. It keeps falling every year. It hasn't been raised in quite some time. A large number of states and localities have raised their minimum wage, but you can start by, you want to raise wages? Raise the federal minimum wage.
That when I speak with small business managers, they say, well, If I have to go to $18 and $20 for minimum wage like Bank of America is doing right now, I'm going to have to fire people.
So we've heard that. We've looked at the famous Card Kruger, my former boss in the Treasury Department, Alan Kruger. Other people have shown empirically, it's a nice theoretical argument, much like our interest rate should be sky high right now with $22 trillion of debt. But empirically, raising the minimum wage is an effective way to raise wages and doesn't have these large employment differences. As you point out, in some markets, bank tellers and other things are getting paid more for a variety of good economic purposes. Those jobs have tended to be higher than the minimum wage.
I don't understand that. Why would that not be an impact? If I'm a business owner and I have a certain number of employees and I raise that, it's going to cost me more. I'm going to have to fire some people.
So let me ask. So I have a buddy who runs a small coffee shop in Silver Spring, Maryland. Let me ask you a question. What do you think he pays more for, coffee or swipe fees from credit cards?
Swipe fees?
Yes, by a huge order of magnitude. The cost small businesses face, by the way, and the swipe fee was lowered as part of the Dodd-Frank Act for a small transaction in debit cards. Mm-hmm. The growth in swipe fees on deluxe credit cards that are in most of the wallets in this room.
Unless it's Starbucks.
Right. Well, interesting you say that. One, Starbucks can out-negotiate him on swipe fee, right? Look at when Costco dropped Amex as its exclusive supplier, Amex stock fell 10%, right? That's the business model there. So there's a disadvantage between small business and big business.
Okay, so that was your number one, raise wages. What else?
On the number one mobile payment app, Starbucks. It's a swipe fee play, right? They can do a lot of smart things that make it. The structural points that you're raising about small business versus big business are part of this growing tilting of the economy. It's an area where smart policy can make a big difference.
Andrew?
Yeah, well, trying to think which comment to respond to. Certainly, I would just add that regulatory reform I think is another one I want to put on the table here, because certainly workforce skills are really important. But we've seen time and time again the costs of starting a small business are rising because the costs of regulation have made it very difficult for the economies, if you don't have appropriate economies of scale, to be competitive with larger businesses. I think that's another area that we have spent a lot of time looking at. I think going back to Dodd-Frank reform, you can see this. Small community banks, which are really the economic engines for most of the communities in the United States. Our 5,000 community banks are really kind of unsung heroes in fostering growth around the United States. In the wake of the Dodd-Frank Act, it was very difficult for those small community banks to comply with all that regulation. They had, some of these banks just have 5 or 6 employees, and suddenly they're starting to add 2 or 3 people just to handle all the new regulation. In terms of cost-benefit analysis, clearly didn't make a lot of sense. So what we've been doing is working on streamlining and tailoring regulations so that if you're a smaller business, you have regulations that are appropriate to your size and risks that you present. Certainly larger institutions should have a different regulatory profile. But we've kind of lost perspective in the differences in business models and the risks that they present and had this one-size-fits-all regulation. I think that's a general problem in the way we've done regulation over the last 40 years. And by thinking more about how we tailor regulation so that we don't stifle that really incubator of growth and ingenuity in the American business. Because you can have a very competent and very well-trained workforce, but if you don't have the ability to start those small businesses, to start to employ them, you're going to hit another bottleneck. So I see those two pieces, kind of workforce development and regulatory reform, is really two sides of the same coin in dealing with this, addressing and improving shared prosperity.
By the way, I know you're working also on technology policy.
Yes.
At the NEC, and I want to ask you about that because this is one area where you've got Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz both saying that they want the tech companies to be broken up. Are we going to see heavier regulation on tech?
Well, one area that's really exciting right now in technology, and we spent a lot of time at the NEC on, is the deployment of 5G technology. And if you haven't read up on it, I encourage you to do so, because it is going to be the next wave of new apps. The initial benefit you'll see as it gets deployed will be kind of faster download times, so you can watch Game of Thrones faster. But the real benefit to the economy will be the bandwidth that it will create for entrepreneurs to come up with new apps that honestly I don't think that we can't think of. That's where that entrepreneurial spirit of America is very well suited to 5G. Right now we're leading the world in 5G. We're going to have more deployments by the end of the year than any other country. FCC Chairman Jeet Pai has done a fantastic job of spearheading this effort. It's another area though that we look at as we look for the future and making sure that we have the infrastructure necessary to compete in the world. We think a lot about infrastructure in terms of kind of concrete and ports and airports, and certainly that's an important part of it. But we also have to think the technological infrastructure that we need to have, and 5G is really the center of that. It's a very exciting area.
You all agree on this?
Yeah, no, look, I think the 5G point is spot on. Here's a regulation that we should get rid of on community banks. All those suspicious activity reports they're filing for all the cannabis shops in Los Angeles. I don't think Uncle Sam needs a small bank regulatory guy to tell him that they're cannabis shops. And if he wants to find him, Uncle Sam has Google Maps. It's a much more efficient way. There's a bipartisan bill passed the House.
Uncle Sam go, oh, I get it.
45 to 15. All the freshman class of the Republicans, right, who, by the way, were folks from pretty safe districts because they wouldn't be there otherwise with this last wave election, all the freshman Republicans joined the Democrats and some others on this legislation. Senator Warren and Senator Cory Gardner have a bipartisan bill. I mean, let's stop this mountain of silly paperwork on this state licensed cannabis across the board as one small step to reduce regulatory burden.
If we create a commission, I'll have to do all of these different things. Like, for example, on regulation, a lot of states have like 50 occupations that you need a license, right? I mean, I know a lawyer should pass a test. Does really a manicurist have to be licensed before? And it really stops labor mobility and things. So there's a lot of things. If we just got a commission of people and said, totally nonpartisan, you would find so many things that people could agree on. Well, let's just do it.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good job.
Thank you for attending. Please make your way to the next session.